The archival photograph is dated 1876. It was captured on glass in the harsh summer light of rural Missouri, a document of prosperity and union. It shows a man and a woman standing before a sturdy stone farmhouse, their forms rigid and unsmiling as the long exposure demanded. This is the mundane grounding of the record. The subtle aberration is in the eyes. The groom, a man of 50 years, gazes directly into the lens with an expression of ironclad ownership. The bride, a girl of no more than 19, does not. Her head is tilted just enough that her gaze falls somewhere beyond the camera's frame, upon a space a few inches to the left of the man who holds her arm. The impossible revelation, confirmed by a baptismal certificate filed 13 years prior in the same county courthouse, is that the bride in the photograph, Caroline Voigt, was also the legal daughter of the groom, Heinrich Voigt. If the forgotten voices of history call to you, and this is your first time here, consider subscribing to join our circle of archivists and keep the past within reach. The day of the wedding was hot. A thick, wet heat rose from the fields of corn and wheat that stretched out in every direction from the Voigt homestead. The sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. It was the kind of day that made the air feel heavy in the lungs, that made sweat bead on the back of a man's neck before he had even walked from the house to the barn. Heinrich Voigt had built an empire from this soil. He had arrived from Germany 30 years before with nothing but the clothes on his back and a capacity for relentless work. Now, he was a man of considerable standing in the German immigrant community of Concordia. His farm was the largest in the county, his house a two-story monument of limestone and dark timber, a fortress of success against the wildness of the American frontier. He was a man who understood order. His fields were planted in perfectly straight lines. His fences were always in good repair. His finances were managed with a precision that bordered on obsession. It was this same sense of order that he sought to restore to his household. His first wife, Liesel, had died 2 years prior. The death was sudden, a fever that took her in less than a week, and it had left a hole in the fabric of his well-managed life. Today, that hole was being filled. Inside the house, guests fanned themselves with their programs. They were the pillars of the community, stern-faced farmers in their Sunday best, their hands thick and calloused from a lifetime of labor. Their wives, clad in dark, heavy dresses despite the oppressive heat, their faces set in expressions of polite interest. They had all known Heinrich for years. They respected his wealth. They respected his discipline, but as they sat on the hard-backed chairs arranged in the parlor, they whispered. They spoke of the bride. Her name was Caroline. She had lived in this house for more than a decade, yet she remained a mystery to them, a pale, quiet girl who was seldom seen outside the property lines, a phantom in her own home. The whispers were quiet, disguised behind hands and fluttering fans. They commented on her youth. 19 was young, even for those times. They commented on her beauty. It was a fragile, ethereal kind of beauty, like that of a porcelain doll kept too long in a dark room. Most of all, however, they commented on the resemblance. It was more than a passing similarity. It was an echo. It was as if the ghost of the first Frau Voigt had returned, younger and thinner, to stand in the same spot where she had stood for her own wedding portrait 20 years before. The minister began the service. He was Father Alistair Finch, a young, scholarly priest from St. James Parish, new to the area and not yet familiar with its intricate histories. He spoke of the sanctity of marriage, of the holy union that bound a man and a woman together in the eyes of God. His voice was calm and steady, a river of practiced piety flowing through the tense, humid air of the room. Heinrich Voigt stood beside him, his posture as rigid as the oak trees that dotted his property. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, with a full beard of dark brown shot through with threads of gray. His suit was new, tailored in St. Louis, and it fit him perfectly. He held himself with the unshakable confidence of a man who had bent the world to his will. There was a slight, almost imperceptible limp in his left leg, the only lingering sign of a threshing accident from his youth, a small, humanizing flaw in his otherwise imposing facade. As the minister spoke, Heinrich's sharp blue eyes were fixed on the girl beside him. It was not the adoring gaze of a groom. It was the watchful, appraising gaze of a collector examining his most prized possession. He noted the perfect line of her neck, the dark sweep of her eyelashes against her pale skin. He noted the way her hands, hidden in white gloves, were clasped so tightly together that her knuckles must have been white. Caroline Voigt stood motionless. She was a slip of a thing, lost in a gown of white lace and silk that seemed to belong to another woman from another time. The style was slightly dated, with a high collar that brushed against her chin, making her look even more constrained and fragile. Her dark hair was intricately braided and pinned, not a single strand out of place. It was a severe style, one that pulled the skin taut at her temples and emphasized the delicate, almost breakable structure of her face. She kept her eyes downcast throughout the entire ceremony. She did not look at the minister. She did not look at the assembled guests. She certainly did not look at Heinrich. Her focus seemed to be on a single, dark knot in the polished floorboards, just to the left of the minister's feet. She stared at it with an intensity that suggested it was the only solid thing in a world that was tilting and unreal. Her face was a perfect, beautiful mask of calm. But inside, a frantic bird was beating its wings against the cage of her ribs. She recited her vows in a voice so soft it was almost inaudible, a mere whisper of sound that was swallowed by the thick, heavy air. When Heinrich took her hand to place the ring on her finger, her skin was cold and damp, despite the suffocating heat of the room. He slid the simple gold band onto her finger. It was heavy. It felt less like a symbol of union and more like the final click of a lock. After the ceremony, the guests moved outside into the shaded yard. Tables laden with food had been set up beneath the trees. There was roasted pork and potato salad, fresh bread and apple butter, and a tall, multi-layered cake decorated with sugared flowers. A small string quartet, hired from the city, began to play a gentle German waltz. It was a lavish affair, a clear demonstration of Heinrich Voigt's wealth and status. He moved among his guests, accepting their congratulations with a curt nod and a thin smile. He was a man who did not waste energy on frivolous displays of emotion. His satisfaction was quiet, profound, and absolute. Caroline remained by his side, a silent, graceful shadow. She held a glass of lemonade, her fingers wrapped around the cool, beaded surface. She had a habit, one she had carried since childhood, of tracing patterns on things with her index finger when she was nervous. Now, she traced the rim of the glass, over and over again, a small, repetitive motion that went unnoticed by everyone except for one. Among the guests was an older woman named Frau Schmidt. Her farm bordered the Voigt property to the east. She had lived there for 40 years. She had known Heinrich since he was a young man struggling to clear his first acre of land. She had been friends with his first wife, Liesel. She remembered the day Caroline had arrived. It was more than 10 years ago now, a cold, bitter night in late November. A thick snow had been falling, muffling the world in a blanket of white. Frau Schmidt had been looking out her kitchen window when she saw the lights of a carriage coming up the long lane to the Voigt house. It was an unusual sight. Visitors were rare, especially at that hour and in that weather. She watched as Heinrich came out onto the porch, holding a lantern. A man in a heavy coat climbed down from the driver's seat and opened the carriage door. Heinrich handed him some money and then reached inside. He lifted out a small child. It was a girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old, wrapped in a thin blanket. She was so small and still in his arms that for a moment, Frau Schmidt had thought the child was dead. Heinrich carried her into the house without a word, and the carriage turned around and disappeared back into the swirling snow. The next day, and in the years that followed, no explanation was ever offered. The child was simply there. The few times anyone asked, Heinrich had said simply that she was a distant relative whose parents had passed, and that he had taken her in as his ward. It was a plausible story. Such arrangements were not uncommon, but something about it had never sat right with Frau Schmidt. The secrecy of the arrival, the way the girl was kept so isolated, never sent to the local school, never seen playing with the other children in the community. She was a ghost in the house on the hill. Frau Schmidt watched Caroline now, a young woman in a wedding dress, and she felt a chill creep up her spine that had nothing to do with the cool breeze rustling the leaves overhead. She remembered Liesel, Heinrich's first wife, confessing to her once, years ago, that she was unable to have children. She had said it with a deep, abiding sadness. Frau Schmidt looked at Caroline's face, so uncannily like Liesel's, and then she looked at Heinrich, standing beside her with that same look of unyielding possession. A dark and troubling thought began to form in the back of her mind, a piece of a puzzle she did not want to solve. She said to the woman standing next to her, her voice a low murmur, that it was a strange thing, how much the girl looked like her own mother. The woman agreed, saying it was a miracle she had found a home here after being orphaned so young. Across the lawn, a young man watched the bride with a different kind of intensity. He was Thomas Keller, a cousin of Heinrich's late wife, who had traveled from St. Louis for the occasion. He was 25 years old, a clerk in a legal office, and he saw the world through a lens of facts and evidence, not rumor and superstition. He had not seen Heinrich in several years, and he had never met Caroline. As he watched her, a nagging sense of familiarity pricked at his memory. It was not just her resemblance to his cousin Liesel. It was something else. He was sure he had seen her face before. But where? It wasn't at a family gathering or a church social. The memory was from a different place, a different context. He tried to place it, sifting through the archives of his mind. He watched Caroline move through the crowd. She had a way of making herself small, of seeming to disappear even when she was standing in plain sight. Her eyes were always moving, scanning the faces of the guests, but never landing on any of them. They were the eyes of a hunted animal. Thomas moved closer, pretending to examine the selection of cakes on the dessert table. He got a better look at her face, the delicate arch of her eyebrows, the small pale mole just above her lip. And then it struck him. The memory clicked into place with the force of a physical blow. It was from 3 years ago. His employer had sent him to a less reputable part of St. Louis to deliver some legal papers. It was a district of rundown boarding houses and dimly lit taverns. He had delivered the papers to an address, and as he was leaving, he had seen a young girl, perhaps 16 at the time, being hurried out of a building across the street by a severe-looking woman. The girl had looked terrified. Her face, pale and frightened in the gaslight, had been etched into his memory. It was the same face. He was certain of it. The same eyes, the same mole above her lip. It was impossible. That girl had been an inmate at an orphanage, one with a very poor reputation. He remembered the name of the place, St. Jude's Home for Wayward Girls. He looked at the bride, this supposed ward of the wealthy Heinrich Voigt. A cold dread began to seep into him. He turned to his wife, who was standing beside him. He said, his voice barely a whisper, that he recognized the bride. He said he had seen her before, and he told her from where. The following day was a Sunday. The Sabbath arrived with the same oppressive heat as the day before, but it was a different kind of stillness. It was a holy stillness, enforced by tradition and the stern gaze of the Lutheran God who watched over the German farming communities of Missouri. The sound of the church bell carried for miles across the flat, open land, a lonely, resonant call to order and worship. Heinrich Voigt was a man who observed the Sabbath with the same unyielding discipline he applied to his crops and his finances. At precisely 8 o'clock, the family carriage was brought to the front of the house. Heinrich emerged first, his black Sunday suit as immaculate as his wedding attire. He moved with a sense of profound and righteous purpose. Caroline followed, a step behind him, as was proper. She was dressed in a simple, dark blue dress, her hair covered by a plain bonnet. Her face was pale and composed, but her eyes darted towards the woods that bordered the property. A quick, fleeting glance, as if she were contemplating an impossible escape. Thomas Keller and his wife were the last to emerge from the house. Thomas's mind had not rested all night. The image of the frightened girl from the St. Louis orphanage was superimposed over the face of the silent bride. It was a discordant and deeply unsettling picture. He knew he could not let it go. As the others prepared to board the carriage, Thomas placed a hand on his forehead. He told Heinrich that the heat of the previous day had given him a terrible headache. He said he did not feel well enough to endure the long church service. He said he would prefer to stay behind and rest in the quiet of the house. Heinrich looked at him for a long moment, his sharp blue eyes searching Thomas's face for any sign of deception. Heinrich was a man who distrusted weakness and excuses in equal measure. But Thomas was family, a cousin to his departed Liesel, and the bonds of kinship, however thin, demanded a certain degree of tolerance. Heinrich gave a curt nod. He said that the house was indeed quiet and that Thomas should rest. He then helped Caroline into the carriage, his hand lingering for a moment on her arm, a gesture of ownership for all to see. The carriage pulled away, its wheels crunching on the gravel drive, leaving Thomas alone in the vast, silent house. He stood on the porch and watched until the carriage was a small black speck on the horizon. The silence that descended was absolute. It was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the front hall, each tick a second falling away, each talk a second closer to the family's return. He knew what he had to do. The feeling of transgression was a cold knot in his stomach, but the conviction of the girl's face, the memory of her terror, was stronger. He walked through the downstairs rooms. They were meticulously clean, suffocatingly orderly. Heavy, dark wood furniture stood polished and gleaming. Lace doilies sat perfectly centered on every surface. The air was still and smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. This was Heinrich's kingdom, a world built on control. Thomas's destination was the study. It was a room that was unequivocally Heinrich's domain. The door was a thick slab of oak. It was not locked. He turned the heavy brass knob and stepped inside. The room was dark, the heavy velvet curtains drawn against the morning sun. The air was thick with the scent of leather, pipe tobacco, and something else, something metallic and cold, like the smell of a bank vault. Dominating the room was a massive roll-top desk. It was a fortress of pigeonholes, small drawers, and secret compartments. It was the administrative heart of the Voigt farm, the place where Heinrich's will was translated into numbers and instructions. Thomas knew that if there were any secrets, they would be held within the dark wood of that desk. He moved behind the desk and sat in Heinrich's large leather chair. It sighed under his weight. For a moment, he did nothing, listening to the frantic beating of his own heart against the oppressive silence. He felt like a thief, a desecrator of a private shrine, but the law was his trade. He understood that truth was often a buried thing, something that had to be unearthed with careful, deliberate prying. He took a deep breath and rolled up the desk's slatted cover. It made a loud, rattling sound in the quiet room, like the drawing of a bolt. Before him lay a world of perfect order. Pens were arranged by size. Stacks of paper were perfectly squared. Ledgers were lined up like soldiers on parade. He began his search methodically. He opened the larger drawers first. They contained what he expected to find: deeds for land, records of crop yields, receipts for equipment. Every transaction was recorded in Heinrich's neat, precise hand. There was no detail too small for his attention. It was the work of a man obsessed with control, a man who left nothing to chance. For almost an hour, Thomas found nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to explain the presence of a girl from a St. Louis orphanage. Doubt began to creep in. Perhaps he had been mistaken. Perhaps the resemblance was just a cruel coincidence. Then, in a deep drawer filled with old account books, his fingers brushed against a smaller, leather-bound volume. It was not a financial ledger. It was a personal journal. The dates inside spanned several years, beginning just after the death of his first wife, Liesel. The entries were short, written in a cramped, spidery German script. Thomas could read German, though not fluently. He had to decipher the old-fashioned lettering slowly. Much of it was mundane. Notes about the weather, the price of corn, a sick horse. But then he found an entry from a few months after Liesel's death. It was a single, chilling phrase. Heinrich had written about the need to protect his legacy. He wrote about the importance of keeping the household intact. The German phrase, Den Haushalt intakt halten, repeated itself over several entries. It was an odd choice of words. It spoke of the home not as a place of grief and family, but as a system, a machine that needed to be maintained. It was the language of a proprietor, not a grieving husband. Thomas felt a cold certainty begin to crystallize in his gut. This was not just about maintaining a farm. It was about something else entirely. He continued his search, his fingers now moving with a renewed sense of urgency. He began to press on the wooden panels inside the desk, searching for a hidden release, a secret compartment. His legal training had taught him that men like Heinrich often had a place for things that were not meant for public view. His fingers found a small, almost invisible seam in the wood at the back of a deep pigeonhole. He pressed it. There was a faint click, and a small, narrow drawer slid open from the side of the desk. It was a space no larger than a shoebox. Inside, there were only two items. The first was a faded daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. It was a family portrait. A younger Heinrich sat in a chair, looking directly at the camera with the same proud, unyielding stare. On his knee sat a small girl of about 6 or 7. It was unmistakably Caroline. She was not looking at the camera. Her small, serious face was turned slightly, her eyes fixed on the woman standing behind Heinrich's chair. The woman was Liesel, Thomas's cousin. She stood with one hand on her husband's shoulder, a faint, sad smile on her lips. She looked tired. There were dark circles under her eyes. She was a ghost at her own family's feast. The photograph was a silent, damning testament. It showed a family unit that was never spoken of, a past that had been deliberately erased. The second item in the drawer was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with age. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. It was an official document. At the top, in ornate lettering, were the words, "Certificate of Holy Baptism from St. James Parish." His eyes scanned the document, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The date was 13 years ago. The name of the child was listed as Caroline Voigt. His eyes moved to the space for the mother's name. It read, Liesel Voigt. Then, he looked at the space for the father. The ink was slightly faded, but the name was perfectly clear, written in the priest's elegant cursive. It said Heinrich Voigt. It was not a guardianship paper. It was not an adoption record. It was a baptismal certificate, a legal and holy declaration of parentage. The man who had married Caroline yesterday was, in the eyes of God and the state of Missouri, her biological father. The room suddenly felt very cold. The air grew thin. Thomas placed the paper and the photograph back on the desk. He felt a wave of nausea. This was not a simple scandal. This was a sin of a different order. A monstrous, calculated deception that had been festering in this silent house for over a decade. The distant church bell began to ring again, signaling the end of the service. They would be home soon. He quickly replaced everything, sliding the secret drawer shut, closing the journal, and arranging the ledgers exactly as he had found them. He rolled the desk cover down, the rattling sound now seeming to echo his own shattered nerves. He went to the parlor and sat in a chair, picking up a book but not reading the words. He waited. When the carriage returned, he watched them get out. Heinrich, stern and righteous from his hour with God. Caroline, silent and pale, her face an unreadable mask. He needed to speak to her. He had to know if she was a victim or a conspirator. He found his chance later that afternoon. Heinrich was in the barn, speaking with his foreman. Caroline was in the small garden behind the house, cutting late-season roses. Thomas walked out to her. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the yard. She did not seem to hear him approach. She was snipping the flowers with a delicate, precise motion, her focus absolute. He stood a few feet away from her. He said her name. She flinched, a small, startled movement, and turned to face him. Her eyes were wide with a familiar, hunted look. He did not waste time with pleasantries. His voice was low, so that it would not carry to the house. He told her that he had been in her father's study. He told her what he had found. He described the baptismal certificate. He described the photograph. He watched her face for a reaction. He expected tears, or anger, or a desperate denial. He saw none of these things. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin as white as marble. But her expression was not one of shock. It was one of pure, unadulterated fear. A fear that seemed ancient, a part of her very bones. She stood frozen for a moment, the shears still in her hand. Then she spoke. Her voice was a fragile whisper, like the rustling of dry leaves. She did not deny it. She simply told him that he did not understand. She said the papers in the desk were not the whole story. She said there were other truths, older and darker, that were not written down. She said her marriage had been necessary. She said it was God's will to protect the family. Her eyes darted towards the house, towards the barn, as if the very air was listening. Her reaction was not a confession. It was a warning, a plea for him to stop digging, because the truth he had found was only the first layer of a much deeper and more terrible secret. She was not afraid of the scandal. She was afraid of something larger. She was afraid of Heinrich. That evening, a fragile truce settled over the Voigt farmhouse. It was a silence born not of peace, but of unspoken tensions that coiled in the air like smoke. Dinner was a formal, suffocating affair in the grand dining room. Heinrich sat at the head of the long, polished table, a patriarch enthroned. He spoke little, but his presence dominated the room. He ate with a slow, deliberate precision, his eyes moving from Thomas to Caroline and back again. He was a predator sensing a disturbance in his territory. Caroline sat to his right, a perfect portrait of wifely deference. She barely touched her food, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the intricate floral pattern of the tablecloth. Thomas and his wife sat opposite them, the space between the two couples feeling like a vast, unbridgeable chasm. The only sounds were the clinking of silverware against porcelain and the steady, relentless ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It was a clock that seemed to be counting down to some inevitable, terrible event. Thomas knew he could not remain silent. The fear he had seen in Caroline's eyes was not the fear of a guilty party. It was the terror of a captive. After the meal, Heinrich announced that he had accounts to attend to in his study. He gave a curt nod and left the room. The closing of the study door was a solid, final sound. Thomas's wife, a woman of great intuition, suggested that she was tired from the day's heat and wished to retire early. She gave Thomas a long, meaningful look before leaving the dining room, granting him the privacy he so desperately needed. Now, he and Caroline were alone. The last of the evening light bled through the tall windows, painting the room in shades of gray and deep purple. A single oil lamp on the sideboard cast a warm, flickering glow, creating a small island of light in the growing darkness. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, to gather. The house itself felt complicit, a silent witness holding its breath. Caroline had not moved. She remained at the table, a still, pale figure in the dim light. Thomas pulled his chair closer to hers. He spoke softly, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. He told her that he did not believe she was a willing participant in this deception. He told her that he wanted to help her. He asked her to tell him the truth. For a long time, she said nothing. She simply stared at the flickering flame of the lamp, her eyes reflecting the small, dancing light. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Thomas waited. He did not press her. He understood that he was asking her to break a silence that had been imposed upon her for a lifetime. Finally, she began to speak. Her voice was thin and reedy, a sound that seemed to be pulled from a great and painful depth. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the flame, as if it were a focal point that allowed her to access the forbidden memories. She spoke of her mother, Liesel. She said she remembered her only in fragments, like pieces of a broken dream, a soft hand stroking her hair, a gentle voice humming a German lullaby, the scent of lavender and soap. She said these memories were faint, and that for many years she had wondered if she had invented them. She told him that after her mother's death, everything had changed. The world had shrunk to the size of this house, this property. Heinrich had become her entire world, her sun, her moon, her god. She explained that she had been raised in almost complete isolation. Heinrich had told her that the outside world was a dangerous and sinful place. He told her that she was special, that she had been set apart for a divine purpose. He had been her only teacher. He taught her to read and write, to manage a household, but he also taught her his own version of scripture, a twisted theology in which obedience to him was obedience to God. He controlled everything she read, everything she saw, everything she knew. She had no friends her own age. She was not allowed to attend church, socials, or community gatherings. The servants were instructed not to engage in personal conversation with her. She was a prisoner in a gilded cage, and for a long time, she had not even known she was imprisoned. She believed it was normal. She believed it was love. She spoke of the rule of silence. Heinrich had forbidden her from ever speaking of her mother. Liesel's name was never to be uttered. Her portraits were taken down. Her clothes were packed away. It was as if she had never existed. When Caroline would ask about her, Heinrich's face would become a mask of cold fury. He would tell her that the past was a sickness, and that to dwell on it was to invite damnation. Then, her story took a darker turn. Her voice dropped even lower, becoming almost inaudible. She spoke of the nights. She said that sometimes she would wake from a deep sleep with a feeling that she was being watched. She would open her eyes, and in the sliver of moonlight coming through her bedroom window, she would see him. Heinrich. He would be standing in her open doorway, a tall, broad silhouette against the darkness of the hall. He would not move. He would not speak. He would simply stand there, watching her, sometimes for a few minutes, sometimes for what felt like hours. The silence of his vigil was more terrifying than any threat. It was a silent assertion of his absolute power over her, a reminder that even in her dreams, she was not safe from his gaze. She would lie perfectly still, pretending to be asleep, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, until he finally turned and walked away. She never knew what he wanted. She only knew that his silent presence filled her with a cold and ancient dread. As she grew older, the nature of her instruction changed. When she was 16, the same age Thomas had seen her at the orphanage, Heinrich had sent her away. He had told her it was time for her to receive a more formal, religious education. He had taken her to St. Jude's Home for Wayward Girls in St. Louis. He had told the stern-faced matron that she was a troubled girl, prone to fantasy and disobedience, and that she needed to be taught humility and submission. He left her there for 6 months. She said it was a place of bells and rules and punishments, a place of cold floors and thin blankets and constant gnawing hunger. The other girls were rough and worldly. They mocked her innocence, her strange, cloistered upbringing. It was a calculated cruelty, a psychological breaking. He had cast her out of their isolated Eden and thrown her into a kind of hell, only to rescue her later. When he came to collect her, he presented himself as her savior. He told her that he had seen the error of his ways, that he could not bear to be without her. He brought her back to the farm, and from that day forward, she was different. She was broken. Her will had been replaced by a deep and abiding fear, and a desperate gratitude to the man who had both orchestrated and ended her suffering. It was then that he began to speak of their marriage. He presented it not as a desire, but as a holy necessity. He told her that his first wife, her mother, had made him swear an oath on her deathbed. He claimed Liesel's dying wish was that the family line continue, that the household remain intact, and that the farm be protected from outsiders. He told Caroline that their union was the only way to fulfill this sacred vow. It was God's will, he insisted, a special dispensation for a family chosen by Providence. He twisted scripture to support his claims, weaving a narrative in which their marriage was a holy act, a sacrifice to preserve the legacy her mother had helped to build. To a young woman who knew no other world, who had no other source of information, who had been systematically stripped of her own identity, his words were not a monstrous lie. They were a divine command. She had agreed to the marriage not out of love or even duty, but out of a profound and deeply ingrained terror of disobeying the only authority she had ever known. She believed it was her destiny, a fate she could not escape. Thomas listened, his horror growing with every whispered word. This was a story of manipulation so profound, so complete, that it bordered on the supernatural. Heinrich had not merely controlled Caroline's life, he had constructed her reality. He had built a prison in her mind, and she had been living in it for so long she had forgotten what the sky looked like. The lamplight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Caroline finally fell silent. She had emptied herself of the story, and the effort seemed to have drained her completely. She looked smaller, more fragile than ever. A tear, the first she had shed, traced a slow, glistening path down her pale cheek. Thomas felt a surge of cold, righteous anger. This was not a family matter to be handled with discretion. This was a crime, a monstrous abuse of power that had to be brought into the light. He leaned forward. He told her she was not alone anymore. He swore to her that he would not let this continue. He said he would go to the sheriff in the morning. He would go to the priest. He would expose Heinrich for the monster he was. he would see her freed. He spoke with the conviction of a man who believed in the power of law and justice. As he said the words, a change came over Caroline. The fear in her eyes was replaced by something else, a new, more immediate terror. She looked past him, towards the dark, looming doorway of the study. She shook her head, a small, frantic motion. She whispered that he could not. She said that Heinrich would never allow it. She said he would know. He always knew. Her words were not a warning. They were a prophecy. At that moment, a sudden, violent cough racked her body. It was a deep, guttural sound that seemed to tear at her lungs. She pressed a hand to her chest, her face contorting in pain. Another cough followed, and then another. She began to tremble, her body shaking uncontrollably. Thomas reached out to steady her, and his hand touched her forehead. It was burning hot. A sudden, raging fever had taken hold of her. It had come on with an unnatural speed, as if a switch had been flipped. She swayed in her chair, her eyes fluttering. He called her name, but her gaze was unfocused, distant. Before he could decide what to do, the study door opened. Heinrich stood there, his large frame filling the doorway. He was not looking at Thomas. His cold, blue eyes were fixed on Caroline, and on his face was an expression that was not concern, but something else. Something that looked chillingly like satisfaction. The illness descended upon Caroline like a shroud. It was swift and merciless, a fever that seemed to consume her from the inside out. Within an hour of her coughing fit in the dining room, she was barely conscious, her body racked with violent shivers despite the burning heat of her skin. Heinrich moved with a calm, unnerving efficiency. He lifted Caroline from her chair as if she weighed nothing at all. He carried her upstairs to the master bedroom, the same room that had once belonged to her mother. Thomas followed, his mind reeling with suspicion and a growing sense of dread. The speed and severity of the illness felt unnatural. It was too convenient, too perfectly timed. Heinrich laid Caroline on the large four-poster bed and gently drew the covers up to her chin. He then turned to Thomas, his face an impassive mask. He said that Caroline had always been delicate. He said she was prone to such fevers, a weakness inherited from her mother. He said he would take care of her. His voice was a low, soothing rumble, but his eyes were cold and hard as river stones. They held a clear, unspoken command. This was his house. This was his wife. Thomas was an outsider, and his presence was no longer welcome. From that moment on, Caroline's room became a sealed chamber. Heinrich became her sole nursemaid, her jailer. He kept the door closed at all times. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, plunging the room into a perpetual twilight. The world outside, with its bright, unforgiving sunlight and the rustling sounds of life, ceased to exist for her. Her world was now the confines of the bed, the landscape of the sweat-soaked sheets, the oppressive weight of the air in the dark, still room. Thomas tried to see her. He insisted. He was her cousin by marriage, he argued. He had a right to check on her welfare. Heinrich, calmly, firmly, refused him. He stood in the hallway outside her door, a silent, immovable guard. He said that the doctor had been sent for, but that for now, the patient needed absolute quiet. He said that visitors would only agitate her. His politeness was a thin veneer over a core of unyielding steel. Thomas was forced to retreat, his frustration and suspicion mounting with every passing hour. He was a prisoner in the house, as much as Caroline was a prisoner in her room. A strange and unsettling quiet fell over the homestead. Heinrich had dismissed most of the household staff. He had told them there was a contagion, a summer fever that could spread, and that it was best for them to return to their own families until it had passed. he sent them away with a generous week's wages, a gesture that seemed less like kindness and more like a bribe for their silence and absence. Only one maid remained, an older, stoic German woman named Greta who had been with the family for 20 years. She was fiercely loyal to Heinrich, her devotion born of decades of service and a fear she would never admit. She cooked the meals and cleaned the downstairs rooms, moving through the house like a ghost, her face set in a permanent, worried frown. She would not meet Thomas's eyes. When he tried to ask her about Caroline's condition, she would purse her lips and shake her head, murmuring in German that it was not her place to speak of such things. She would say only that Herr Voigt was a good man, and that he knew what was best for his wife. The doctor never arrived. Thomas waited all day, watching the long, empty road that led to the farm, but no carriage appeared. When he confronted Heinrich about it, Heinrich had a ready explanation. He said the doctor was attending to a difficult birth in a neighboring county and would not be able to come until the following day. It was a plausible lie, but Thomas did not believe it. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that no help was coming. Heinrich was isolating Caroline, cutting her off from any potential aid, any prying eyes. He was in complete control of the situation. He was the only one who entered her room. Several times a day, he would emerge from the darkened chamber, carrying a small tray. On it would be a bowl of untouched broth, a glass of water, and a small brown bottle of medicine with an unmarked label. He would take the tray to the kitchen, wash the items himself, and then return to his vigil. A peculiar, cloying odor began to linger in the upstairs hallway. It was a sweet, earthy smell, like damp soil and wilted flowers. It seeped from under the closed bedroom door, a scent of sickness and decay that seemed to cling to the very air. Thomas became a restless, anxious presence in the silent house. He paced the downstairs rooms, his mind a whirlwind of terrible possibilities. He felt helpless, trapped. He considered leaving, riding to town to fetch the sheriff himself, but a deep, instinctual fear held him back. He was afraid of what Heinrich might do to Caroline if he were left completely alone with her. He feared that if he left, he might return to find something far worse than a fever. He was also a man of the law. He had suspicions, but he had no proof. What could he tell the sheriff? That a man was caring for his sick wife? That he was protective of her privacy? He would be dismissed as a meddling relative, a hysterical city dweller who did not understand the rugged self-sufficiency of country life. He was caught in a terrible, paralyzing bind. He could not stay, and he could not leave. On the second night of Caroline's illness, Thomas was awakened by a sound. It was a low, murmuring voice from upstairs. He got out of bed and crept into the hallway, his heart pounding. The sound was coming from Caroline's room. It was her voice, but it was strange, altered. She was speaking in German, her words slurred and disconnected, the fevered ramblings of a delirious mind. He pressed his ear to the thick oak door, straining to make out what she was saying. For a long time, it was just a stream of nonsensical phrases, fragments of memory and fear. Then, a single word emerged from the fog, repeated over and over again with a child's pleading insistence. Mutti. She was calling for her mother. The word was a knife in the quiet darkness of the house. She was calling for the woman whose name she was forbidden to speak, the woman who had been erased from the history of this house, the woman whose ghost, it seemed, still lingered in the shadows. Thomas could hear Heinrich's voice from inside the room, a low, urgent murmur, trying to soothe her, to silence her. He was not speaking to her with the gentle tones of a concerned husband. There was an edge of anger in his voice, a frustration that she would not be quiet. The following morning, the world outside conspired to tighten the trap. Thomas awoke to the sound of a torrential downpour. A summer storm had rolled in during the night, a violent tempest of wind and rain. The sky was a dark, bruised purple, and the rain fell in solid gray sheets, turning the farmyard into a sea of mud. The creek that ran along the edge of the property, normally a gentle, meandering stream, had swollen into a raging, muddy river. It overflowed its banks, flooding the low-lying fields and washing out the only road that connected the farm to the town of Concordia. They were cut off. The Voigt homestead had become an island, isolated from the rest of the world. The storm raged for 2 full days. The wind howled around the corners of the stone house, and the rain beat a relentless tattoo on the roof. Inside, the oppressive silence was broken only by the sounds of the storm and the faint, intermittent murmuring that still leaked from under Caroline's door. Heinrich seemed unaffected by the storm. His routine did not change. He continued his vigil, his trips to and from the sick room marked by the quiet click of the door latch. He seemed to draw strength from the isolation, to welcome the storm as an ally that had fortified his defenses. Thomas felt a rising tide of panic. The isolation was no longer just a circumstance. It felt like a sentence. The house was no longer just a home. It had become a tomb, and the storm was the stone that had been rolled in front of the door. The sweet, cloying smell in the upstairs hall grew stronger, heavier, and it began to mingle with the damp, earthy smell of the rain-soaked world outside. It was the smell of secrets being buried. On the morning of the 3rd day, the storm broke. The relentless drumming of rain on the roof ceased, and a profound, heavy silence descended upon the land. The world outside the windows was washed clean, but it was a wounded world. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, and the air was thick with a damp, swampy humidity. The floodwaters had begun to recede, but the road to town remained a river of thick, brown mud, impassable by horse or carriage. The farm was still an island, a prison surrounded by a moat of its own making. From a downstairs window, Thomas Keller watched Heinrich Voigt walk out into the ruined landscape. Heinrich moved with his usual unhurried, deliberate gait, his slight limp more pronounced in the thick mud. He was surveying the damage to his kingdom. He walked the fence lines. He checked the foundations of the barn. He stared out at the flattened fields of corn. He was an architect of order, and the storm had brought chaos to his doorstep. For the first time in days, he was not in the house. He was not standing guard outside Caroline's door. He was distracted. And Thomas knew, with a surge of adrenaline that was part terror and part resolve, that this was his only chance. He moved through the silent house. His own footsteps on the polished wood floors sounded like gunshots in the stillness. He went first to the kitchen. The maid, Greta, was not there. He was completely alone. His eyes scanned the room, searching for something, anything, that could serve as a tool. On the hearth, next to the large cooking fireplace, was a set of heavy iron implements, a shovel for the ash, a brush, a pair of tongs, and a long, slender fire poker with a hooked end. It was solid. It was heavy. He took it in his hand. The cold, rough iron was a comfort, a small piece of purpose in a world of helpless waiting. He carried it with him as he walked back into the main hall. He looked once more out the window. Heinrich was a small, distant figure now, standing near the swollen creek at the far edge of the property. His back was turned. It was time. Thomas started up the grand curving staircase, the poker held tight in his fist. Each step groaned under his weight, the sound a protest against his transgression. The air grew thicker as he ascended, the sweet, cloying smell from Caroline's room now an almost physical presence, a foul miasma that coated the back of his throat. He reached the top of the stairs and stood for a long moment in the upstairs hall. The door to Caroline's room was directly in front of him. It was a formidable barrier of dark, heavy oak. The brass knob was tarnished. The keyhole was a small, black void. He listened. There was no sound from within, no delirious murmuring, no pained breathing. Only a silence that was deeper and more absolute than the quiet of the house. A silence that felt like the end of things. He tried the knob first, a futile, hopeful gesture. It did not turn. It was locked, just as he knew it would be. He looked at the lock. It was old. A simple mortise lock. The mechanism was housed within the wood of the door itself. Breaking it would not be a quiet process. He hesitated, his heart hammering against his ribs. He imagined the sound of splintering wood echoing across the wet fields. He imagined Heinrich turning, his distant figure growing larger as he walked back towards the house, his pace quickening. The fear was a cold, paralyzing hand on his shoulder. But then he remembered the fear in Caroline's eyes, the story of the silent watcher in her doorway, the desperate, fevered cry for her mother. His resolve hardened. He could not leave her in that room. He wedged the tip of the poker into the small gap between the door and the frame, just beside the lock. He put his shoulder against the door and pushed, using the poker as a lever. The wood groaned, a high, screeching sound that set his teeth on edge. He pushed harder. Sweat beaded on his forehead, stinging his eyes. He heard a crack. A small splinter of wood flew from the doorframe and landed on the floor. He paused, listening, his breath held tight in his chest. Nothing. No sound from outside. He repositioned the poker and pushed again, this time with all his weight, all his fear, all his anger. There was a loud, violent crack, the sound of wood fibers tearing apart, and the door swung inward a few inches. The lock had been broken. The way was open. He pulled the door fully open and stepped inside, his eyes struggling to adjust to the profound darkness of the room. The air that rushed out to meet him was thick and cool and smelled of damp earth, wilted lilies, and something medicinal and bitter. It was the smell of a tomb. The room was a cave of shadows. The heavy curtains were drawn so tightly that only a single thin sliver of gray light penetrated the gloom, cutting across the room like a scar. It illuminated a blizzard of dust motes, dancing slowly in the still, stagnant air. The grand four-poster bed dominated the space, its dark wood frame like the skeleton of some great, sleeping beast. And on the bed, lost in a sea of white sheets and pillows, was Caroline. She was lying on her back, her face turned towards the ceiling. She was perfectly still. Her skin, in the single shaft of light, was the color of old wax. It had a strange, translucent quality, and it was pulled taut over the delicate bones of her face. Her dark hair was splayed out on the pillow around her head like a dark halo. Her eyes were half open, but they were dull and unfocused, staring at something beyond the ceiling, beyond the roof, beyond the bruised and weeping sky. Her breathing was so shallow, so faint, that for a terrible moment, Thomas thought he had arrived too late. He stepped closer to the bed, his boots silent on the thick Persian rug. He reached out a trembling hand and touched her forehead. It was no longer burning, it was cool. A damp, unnatural cold that seemed to seep into his own skin. She was alive, but only just, a flickering candle flame on the verge of being extinguished. His eyes scanned the room. It was a place of oppressive order. A book lay closed on the bedside table. A glass of water sat untouched. Everything was neat, clean, controlled. This was not the chaotic sick room of a person fighting a fever. It was a carefully managed stage. And then he saw it, sitting on the nightstand, next to the glass of water and the brown, unlabeled medicine bottle, was a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was made of dark rosewood, its surface covered in carvings of vines and leaves. It was an old, beautiful thing, a box meant for holding treasures or secrets. It did not belong among the sick room paraphernalia. It felt out of place, a relic from another time. With a sense of encroaching dread, Thomas picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. The lid was not locked. He lifted it. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded black velvet, were two objects. The first was a simple gold wedding band. It was worn smooth with time, its surface covered in the tiny scratches and dents of a long life. He knew instinctively that it had belonged to Liesel. It was the symbol of her own union with Heinrich, a union that had ended in this very room. The second object was a thick lock of dark brown hair, tied with a faded blue silk ribbon. It was the color of Caroline's hair, the color of Liesel's hair in the old daguerreotype. It was a memento mori, a keepsake taken from a loved one after death. The box was not a jewelry box. It was a shrine, a private, morbid altar to the dead. Heinrich was not just replacing his first wife. He was attempting to transform his daughter into her, and now that the transformation was complete with the wedding, the new vessel was being discarded. The medicine bottle on the table suddenly seemed to Thomas to be the most sinister object in the world. The sweet, cloying smell in the room was not the smell of sickness. It was the smell of a slow, deliberate poison, administered day by day, drop by drop, a poison that mimicked a fever, that slowly cooled the blood and quieted the heart. This was not a tragedy, it was an execution. As this horrifying realization washed over him, Caroline made a sound. It was a dry, rasping whisper, the sound of dead leaves skittering across pavement. Her head turned slightly on the pillow, and her dull eyes moved, not to him, but to the foot of the bed. Her lips parted, and she spoke, her voice a fragile thread of sound in the suffocating silence. She said that her mother was there. She said she saw her standing at the foot of the bed. Her gaze was fixed on an empty space, a patch of shadow between the two dark posts of the bed frame. She whispered that her mother came to her every night, that she would stand there and watch, her face sad. Caroline's whisper was not filled with fear. It was filled with a strange, mournful acceptance. She said that her mother was waiting for her. She said it was almost time to go. Thomas stared at the empty space where she was looking, and despite himself, a cold dread prickled the skin on the back of his neck. The room felt suddenly colder, the shadows deeper. He could see nothing, but he could feel a presence, a weight of sorrow and silent rage that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the room. It was the ghost of Liesel, a spectral witness to the final, monstrous act of her husband's tyranny. Thomas backed away from the bed. The carved box felt heavy as a gravestone in his hand. He had to get out. He had to get help. His indecision, his caution, had been a terrible mistake. He had wasted days while Caroline was being slowly murdered. He turned and fled the room, leaving the broken door swinging open behind him. He ran down the stairs, his mind screaming. He reached the front hall and fumbled with the heavy bolt on the door. He had to get to town. The road was mud, but he could walk. He could run. He would bring the sheriff back. He would bring justice back to this godforsaken house. He finally slid the bolt free and pulled the massive door open, the damp, humid air of the outside world rushing in. He was about to step out onto the porch, to run for his life, to run for Caroline's life, when a large shadow fell over him. Heinrich Voigt stood on the porch, blocking his path. He must have seen the broken door from the fields. He was covered in mud, his face grim, his blue eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. He looked at Thomas. He looked at the carved box still clutched in Thomas's hand. He showed no surprise, no anger, only a quiet, terrible finality. He had returned. The escape was over. The trap had snapped shut. The confrontation on the porch was not a battle of fists or a clash of angry words. It was a silent, suffocating contest of wills. Heinrich Voigt stood in the doorway, a mountain of quiet fury. He did not speak. He did not need to. His physical presence was an indictment, a judgment. His gaze was fixed on Thomas Keller, and in his eyes, Thomas saw the cold, dispassionate certainty of a man who had anticipated every move, who had already calculated the outcome. Thomas stood frozen in the hall, the carved wooden box still in his hand, its weight a damning piece of evidence. The air between the two men was thick with unspoken accusations, with the smell of damp earth and the sweeter, more sinister scent of the poison that still clung to Thomas's clothes from the upstairs room. Thomas's mind raced. He thought of the fire poker he had left on the floor by Caroline's door. He thought of shouting, of raising an alarm that no one would hear, but his body would not obey. He was paralyzed by the absolute authority that radiated from Heinrich, an authority that had been honed over a lifetime of unquestioned command. This was a man who had bent nature, law, and even God to his own perverse design. What chance did a city clerk have against such a force? Heinrich took one slow step forward, into the hall. He reached out a large, calloused hand, not towards Thomas, but towards the box. It was a simple, silent demand. Thomas looked down at the box, at the secrets it contained. The wedding ring of a dead woman, the lock of hair. It was the heart of the whole monstrous affair. For a moment, he thought of refusing, of throwing the box to the floor and shattering it. But he looked again at Heinrich's face, and he knew that any act of defiance would be his last. He felt a profound, soul-crushing defeat. He had uncovered the truth, but the truth was powerless here. In this isolated kingdom, Heinrich's will was the only law that mattered. Slowly, his fingers uncurling one by one, Thomas handed the box to Heinrich. Heinrich took it without a word. He did not open it. He did not need to confirm its contents. He held it in his hand for a long moment, his thumb tracing the intricate carvings on the lid. Then, with a curt, almost imperceptible nod, he stepped aside, clearing the path to the open door. It was not an act of mercy. It was a dismissal, a silent command for Thomas to leave and never return. Thomas did not need to be told twice. He stumbled out onto the porch, into the gray, humid light. He did not look back. He half walked, half ran down the muddy drive, his fine city shoes sinking into the thick mire. He expected a shout. He expected the sound of a gunshot. But there was only the sound of his own ragged breathing and the squelching of the mud beneath his feet. He did not stop running until the stone farmhouse was hidden from view by a stand of tall oak trees. He kept going, following the washed-out road, his only thought to put as much distance as possible between himself and that house of secrets. It took him hours to reach the outskirts of Concordia. He was covered in mud, his clothes were torn, and his mind was a shattered wreck. He went straight to the sheriff's office. He burst in, babbling his story to a skeptical, weary-looking man with a drooping mustache. He spoke of the locked room, the poison, the baptismal certificate. He spoke of incest and murder. The sheriff listened patiently, his expression unchanging. When Thomas was finished, the sheriff sighed a long, slow sigh. He told Thomas that Heinrich Voigt was a respected man in the community, a pillar of the church. He suggested that Thomas, a city man unaccustomed to the rigors of country life, had perhaps been overcome by the heat, by the stress of the storm. He saw the wildness in Thomas's eyes, and he dismissed it as hysteria. He promised to ride out to the Voigt farm in a day or two, once the roads were properly dry, just to make sure everything was in order. 2 days later, a small party of men, led by the sheriff, made their way up the long, muddy lane to the Voigt homestead. A strange, unnatural quiet hung over the property. No smoke rose from the chimney. No dogs barked at their approach. The front door was slightly ajar. The sheriff called out Heinrich's name. There was no answer. They pushed the door open and stepped into the silent house. The air inside was still and cool. In the grand parlor, they found Heinrich Voigt. He was slumped in his favorite high-backed leather armchair, the one that faced the fireplace. His hands were resting on the armrests, his head tilted slightly to one side. His eyes were wide open, staring at something on the opposite wall that no one else could see. There was no sign of a struggle, no wound, no overturned furniture. A half-empty glass of brandy sat on the small table beside him. The county coroner would later determine that his heart had simply stopped. There was nothing to suggest foul play. He looked like a king who had died peacefully on his throne, his kingdom collapsing into silence around him. The men searched the rest of the house. It was empty. The maid, Greta, was gone. Thomas's wife had apparently fled sometime after he did. They went upstairs. They found the master bedroom. The door frame was splintered, the lock broken. Inside, the room was immaculate. The heavy curtains were drawn back, and pale afternoon light filled the space. The bed was empty. The sheets were clean, the blankets neatly folded at the foot. There was no sign that a sick person had occupied it for days. There was no sign of Caroline at all. It was as if she had never been there. It was as if she had evaporated into the still, quiet air. They searched the house, the barn, the grounds. They found nothing. No note, no body, no trace of the young woman who had been both wife and daughter to the man in the chair. Caroline Voigt had vanished from the face of the earth. As the men were preparing to leave, one of the deputies noticed the small, carved wooden box sitting on the mantelpiece above the fireplace in the parlor. He picked it up and opened it. The gold wedding ring and the lock of hair were gone. In their place, nestled on the faded black velvet, was a single, new photograph, a daguerreotype that still smelled faintly of the developing chemicals. It was a portrait of a woman. It was Caroline. She was wearing a simple, dark dress that looked strangely familiar, a style from a generation before. Her hair was pulled back severely, and her expression was calm, serene, and unreadable. She was standing outside, next to a weathered, lichen-covered tombstone in what was clearly the small family cemetery on the Voigt property. The deputy, who had been to the farm before, recognized the grave immediately. It was the final resting place of Liesel Voigt, Heinrich's first wife. In the photograph, Caroline stood beside her mother's grave, a silent guardian, a specter returned to claim her own history. She looked like a woman who had finally come home. The sheriff took the photograph and the box as evidence, but they explained nothing. The official investigation concluded that Heinrich Voigt had died of natural causes, and that his young wife, distraught with grief, had simply run away. The case remained open for years, a local curiosity, a piece of rural folklore, but Caroline Voigt was never seen again. Thomas Keller was the one who kept the secret. A few weeks after the events, he received a small, anonymous package in the mail. Inside was the daguerreotype of Caroline at the graveside. There was no note. He understood it as a final, silent communication, a message that the story was over and that it was to be buried. He hid the photograph in the back of a locked drawer in his study, and he never spoke of what he had witnessed at the Voigt farm again. He claimed that no one would believe the truth. He knew that some stories are too dark for the light of day, and that some ghosts are best left to wander the quiet, forgotten corridors of the past, their footsteps unheard, their sorrows unrecorded. The case file on Caroline Voigt is now closed. Thank you for walking these halls of history with us. If you are new here, subscribe to stand among those who will be present when the next case is opened, and leave a comment to share your thoughts on what you have witnessed.